Welcome. Tonight we are going to walk through the whole life of a woman who began as a bitter disappointment and ended as the name that still defines an entire age. Her name is Elizabeth Tudor. Most people know the image: the white face, the red wig, the pearls, the Armada portrait with her hand resting on a globe. But the woman behind that image spent her first decades just trying to stay alive, and her last decades carrying a country on her back, while the men around her begged her to hand it over to a husband. The full arc of that life, from the moment she was declared a bastard to the moment she took her final breath at Richmond, is worth every minute of the next 2 hours. So let's begin, not at the beginning, but at a moment when it almost all ended. The rain was falling hard outside Hampton Court Palace in October of 1562. Inside a candlelit bedchamber, Elizabeth Tudor, 29 years old, lay unconscious in a massive carved bed. Her face was covered in the angry red pustules of smallpox. The fever had been burning through her for days, and now she had slipped into a deep coma. Her pulse was so faint that the royal physicians could barely find it. They shook their heads and stepped back. In the adjoining chamber, the Privy Council gathered in emergency session. They kept their voices low, but the panic was unmistakable. There was no husband, there was no child, there was no designated heir. If Elizabeth died tonight, England would tear itself apart. Names were whispered. Mary Stuart, the Catholic Queen of Scotland, sitting just across the northern border. Catherine Grey, the Protestant sister of the executed Jane. Every choice meant civil war. As the council argued, a lady-in-waiting approached the bed. She knelt beside the Queen, took the heavy coronation ring from her own pocket, and gently pressed it into Elizabeth's cold palm. It was the ring that had been placed on her finger at Westminster Abbey 3 years earlier. The woman was preparing her Queen for death. And then, in the grip of that fever dream, Elizabeth's cracked lips moved. She whispered a single name: Robert. Robert Dudley, the man she had loved for years but could never marry. The man whose wife had been found dead at the bottom of a staircase under circumstances nobody dared speak aloud. For several more days, Elizabeth hovered between life and death. The council started drafting letters. Messengers were put on standby. And in that darkened room at Hampton Court, with the coronation ring pressed into her cold hand and her physicians unable to find a pulse, the whole future of England narrowed to a single question no one in the palace could answer: would she wake up? We will come back to that room, but to understand why this woman was facing death alone, without a husband or child beside her, why a queen of 29 had already half decided she would never marry at all, we have to go back to the beginning, back to the day she was born and the father who did not want her. If you'd like to hear more lives told this way, subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Leave a comment if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, because that means we did our job. Now, think about these questions as we go. Who was she, really, underneath all that makeup and silk? The daughter of Anne Boleyn, the most scandalous queen England had ever seen, declared a bastard before she was 3 years old. How did that rejected little girl become the queen who stared down the Spanish Armada and won? What did she have to trade away to keep her throne? And why did a woman who could have had any prince in Europe choose to stand completely alone? The story starts on a bright September afternoon in 1533. The baby arrived on the 7th of September at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, a sprawling red brick riverside palace that Henry VIII had built for pleasure and display. The labour had been long, the anticipation enormous. For years, Henry had been tearing his kingdom apart to make this child possible. He had broken with the Catholic Church, defied the Pope, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and married Anne Boleyn in secret, all because she promised him a son. When the cannons fired from the Tower of London to announce the birth, every person in earshot expected to hear the full royal salute reserved for a prince. But the guns stopped early. A daughter, not a son. Henry's face when they told him is not something anyone recorded, but his actions speak loudly enough. The grand tournament he had ordered to celebrate the birth of a male heir was cancelled. The jousts, the feasts, the triumphal arches being built in the tilt yard were all dismantled overnight. He did not come to see the child right away. When Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, congratulated him, Henry reportedly shrugged it off. "A healthy girl," he said. "Boys will follow." But the deep disappointment was already hardening into something cold inside him. The christening was spectacular, as if Henry wanted to prove to the world that he was not crushed by the sex of his child. Torches lined the route from the palace to the church. The silver font was polished until it shone. The baby was wrapped in cloth of gold and carried by the highest-ranking nobles in the land, but the king was not there. He stayed in his private apartments, watching from a distance. The child was named Elizabeth, after Henry's own mother, Elizabeth of York, the woman whose marriage to Henry VII had ended the Wars of the Roses. The choice was deliberate. It tied this new Tudor baby to the great reconciliation that founded the dynasty. Even without a penis, she was a Tudor, and that name meant something. For the first 2.5 years of her life, Elizabeth was treated as the heir to the throne. She had her own household, a full staff of servants, her own ladies, her own governess. Her older half-sister Mary, the daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been stripped of her title and declared illegitimate. Mary was now simply the Lady Mary, forced to serve in Elizabeth's nursery, ordered to curtsy to the infant princess. The humiliation burned deep in Mary, and it would shape the relationship between the two sisters for decades to come. But everything rested on Anne Boleyn producing a son, and Anne knew it. By early 1536, she was pregnant again. Then she miscarried. The child was a boy. Henry looked at her with a gaze that was already moving elsewhere. Within weeks, his attention had fixed on Jane Seymour, a quiet, pale young woman who was everything Anne was not: demure, obedient, and seemingly fertile. On the 2nd of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges of adultery, incest with her own brother, and high treason. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. The men accused of sleeping with her included a musician, a courtier, and her own brother George. The king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, built the case with ruthless efficiency. Henry signed off on everything. Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old. She was at Hatfield, a comfortable country palace, with her household of nurses and tutors. She would have noticed the sudden tension, the hushed conversations, the servants disappearing. But nobody told a toddler that her mother was in the Tower of London. Nobody explained why her father had stopped visiting. On the morning of May 19th, Anne Boleyn walked out onto a scaffold inside the tower walls. She wore a grey damask gown trimmed with fur. Her dark hair was pinned up under a simple linen cap. A swordsman had been brought from Calais, a more merciful executioner than the axe. Anne knelt upright, blindfolded, and the sword came down in a single stroke. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave under the floor of the Tower Chapel. The next morning, Henry VIII left Greenwich at dawn. By 10 o'clock he was at Jane Seymour's house, betrothing himself to her. They were married 11 days later. In her nursery at Hatfield, Elizabeth's world was dismantled piece by piece. The news of her mother's death arrived, and then the legal documents followed. Parliament passed a new Act of Succession. Elizabeth, like Mary before her, was declared illegitimate. She was no longer Princess Elizabeth. She was now the Lady Elizabeth, a bastard with no claim to the throne. Her household was stripped down, servants were dismissed, the luxurious things were packed up and taken away. She was moved from Hatfield to a series of more modest manor houses, tucked out of sight, her expenses cut to the bone. The woman who stepped into the gap was Margaret Bryan, an experienced governess who had also raised Mary as a child. Lady Bryan wrote letters to Thomas Cromwell begging for money because the child was growing out of her clothes and there was no budget for new ones. "My Lady Elizabeth has neither gown nor kirtle nor petticoat," she wrote in one surviving letter, her frustration bleeding through the parchment. She also reported that Elizabeth was sharp, curious, and already learning her letters at an astonishing speed. A quiet, watchful child who rarely cried and never asked about her mother. The other woman who shaped those early years was Catherine Champernowne, known to the household as Cat Ashley. Cat arrived as a nursemaid and stayed for 30 years, becoming Elizabeth's governess, her confidant, and eventually the woman she trusted more than anyone on earth. Cat taught Elizabeth to read. She sat with her when she was sick. She held her when the nightmares came. And Cat was the one who made sure Elizabeth never forgot who she really was, whispering to her in the dark, "You are a Tudor. You are the daughter of a king." Elizabeth's education began early and it became her refuge. By the time she was 4, she could read English. By 5, she had started Latin. She threw herself into books as if they were a door out of the room she had been locked into. While her father moved through wives like chapters in a book, she kept her head down and her eyes on the page. She had one secret possession, a small ring. Inside it was a miniature portrait of a woman with dark hair and a B initial, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth would wear that ring for decades, keeping it hidden, never speaking her mother's name aloud in public. The girl learned very young that some loves had to be carried in silence. By the time Elizabeth turned 4, her father had already moved on to his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, who finally gave him the son he wanted, Edward. Jane died 12 days after the birth. Henry was devastated in his own way, but he wasted no time finding a 4th wife. Elizabeth and Mary were both brought back to court briefly for the new marriage to Anne of Cleves, a political match that collapsed almost immediately when Henry found her unattractive. He divorced her after 6 months. Then came Catherine Howard, a girl barely older than Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, pretty and reckless. Elizabeth was 8 when Catherine Howard was crowned queen, and 9 when Catherine was dragged screaming through the palace corridors and arrested for adultery. Catherine Howard was executed in February of 1542. She was somewhere around 19 years old. Elizabeth watched the adults around her whisper and go pale. She saw another stepmother vanish. She began to put the pieces together. Marriage, for a woman close to the throne, was a death sentence if you made the wrong move. Love and sex and royal favour were tangled up in a knot that could tighten around your throat without warning. By the time she was 9, Elizabeth had lost her mother, 2 stepmothers, her status, and her home. She had learned to read the room before she could read a book. She knew when to be silent. She knew when to smile. She had started to build the shell that would protect her for the rest of her life. But she was still a child, and somewhere inside that shell there was a girl who just wanted her father to look at her. That wouldn't happen for a long time, and when it finally did, it would come in the shape of another woman, the 6th wife, the one who would change everything. Catherine Parr entered Elizabeth's life in the summer of 1543, and nothing would ever be quite as lonely again. Parr was 31 years old, twice widowed, well-read, fluent in Latin and French, and quietly reformist in her religious views. She had caught Henry VIII's attention not because she was young and dazzling. She was neither, but because she was calm, intelligent, and knew how to manage a man whose leg was rotting from an old jousting wound and whose temper now flared at the smallest provocation. Henry needed a nurse as much as a wife, and Parr accepted the role with her eyes open. What set Parr apart from every other woman Henry married was her determination to bring the fractured Tudor family back together. She saw the king's 3 children scattered across different palaces, none of them secure, none of them fully acknowledged, and she decided to do something about it. She began writing to Elizabeth, warm letters, full of affection and genuine interest. She invited the girl to court. She spoke to Henry about the importance of having his daughters close. Henry, softened by Parr's steady presence and increasingly dependent on her, agreed. In the spring of 1544, Elizabeth arrived at court. She was 10 years old, tall for her age, with her father's reddish gold hair and her mother's dark, watchful eyes. She had been living in the shadows for 7 years. Now she found herself seated at the royal table, included in family gatherings, treated like a daughter of the house. Parr gave her a room near her own. They read together in the evenings. Parr encouraged her to write, to translate, to ask questions. For the first time since she could remember, Elizabeth had something that felt like a mother. Parliament passed a new succession act that year, restoring both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of inheritance after Edward. Legally, they remained illegitimate. Henry could not bring himself to undo that part, but the act said that if Edward died without heirs, the crown would pass to Mary, and then to Elizabeth. It was a half vindication, a cautious step back toward legitimacy, and Elizabeth understood exactly how fragile it was. One wrong word, one whisper of suspicion, and the whole thing could collapse. With her place at court secured, Elizabeth's education expanded dramatically. Parr believed that women should be as learned as men, a radical idea in the 1540s, and she hired the best tutors she could find. The first was William Grindal, a young Cambridge scholar who drilled Elizabeth in Latin and Greek until she was reading Demosthenes and Cicero with ease. When Grindal died suddenly of the plague in 1548, Parr brought in Roger Ascham, one of the finest humanist minds in England. Ascham was a revelation. He taught Elizabeth not through rote memorization, but through conversation, argument, and the careful analysis of texts. They read Livy's History of Rome, and he asked her to debate the decisions of the consuls. They read the speeches of Cicero, and he made her rewrite them in different styles. He later wrote that Elizabeth had a mind free from all womanish weakness, that she was more diligent, more sharp, and more capable of sustained attention than any student he had ever taught. Coming from Ascham, a man not given to flattery, that was something. By the time she was 14, Elizabeth could speak and write fluent Latin, French, Italian, Spanish, and Greek. She was learning Flemish. She could translate complex theological texts from one language to another without losing the nuance. She wrote letters to her brother Edward in Latin that were so elegant he kept them in a drawer and showed them to visitors. When she was 11, she translated a long French poem, The Mirror of the Sinful Soul, by Marguerite de Navarre, into English. She copied it out in her own careful handwriting, bound it in an embroidered cover she had sewn herself, and dedicated it to Catherine Parr. The gift was both an act of love and a political move. The poem was by a Protestant woman, about the soul's direct relationship with God. Elizabeth was signalling where she stood, carefully, without ever saying a word. Her religious education under Parr and Ascham shaped the rest of her life. Both leaned Protestant, but they were not radicals. They believed in reform, not revolution. They taught Elizabeth to value order, obedience, and a middle path. This was the seed of the religious settlement she would later build as queen. It was also the seed of a deep personal conviction. Elizabeth was never a passionate believer in the way some of her contemporaries were. She was a pragmatist. Religion, for her, was always connected to stability, and stability was the thing she craved above all else. In January of 1547, Henry VIII died. He was 55 years old, grossly overweight, his body riddled with infection. Elizabeth was 13. She received the news at Enfield, where she was living with her younger brother Edward. When the messenger arrived, the two children held each other and wept. They wept for the father they had barely known, the towering figure who had dominated every room he entered, and who had, in the end, done just enough to keep them alive. Edward, 9 years old, became King Edward VI. The real power lay with his uncle, Edward Seymour, who became Lord Protector. Elizabeth was placed in the household of her stepmother, Catherine Parr, who had retired to her country estate at Chelsea. Parr had done something that surprised everyone. Within months of Henry's death, she had secretly married Thomas Seymour, the Lord Protector's younger brother. Seymour was handsome, charming, ambitious, and deeply reckless. He had been sniffing around Elizabeth even before Henry died, and now he had married his way directly into the royal household. Elizabeth arrived at Chelsea in the spring of 1547, still grieving her father, still adjusting to her brother's new status, and walked straight into a situation that would teach her more about power and danger than any book ever could. Thomas Seymour was 38 years old. Elizabeth was 14. Seymour made a habit of visiting her bedchamber early in the morning, before she was dressed. He would burst through the door in his nightshirt, laughing, and throw himself onto her bed. He would tickle her. He would slap her on the bottom. He would chase her around the room while she screamed and giggled, half terrified, half confused. Her governess, Kat Ashley, watched all of this with growing alarm. She confronted Seymour. She told him to stop. He laughed her off. Catherine Parr, incredibly, participated in some of these episodes. She held Elizabeth down once while Seymour cut her gown to ribbons with a knife. It was a game, they said, just horseplay. But the subtext was obvious to everyone in the household. Seymour was grooming a teenage princess, and Parr, desperate to keep her husband's attention and terrified of losing him, was enabling it. Kat Ashley was the one who finally put a stop to it. She warned Elizabeth to be more careful, to lock her door, to avoid being alone with Seymour. Elizabeth, who had no mother and no father to protect her, listened to her governess. She started getting up earlier. She stayed in common rooms. She kept other ladies around her at all times. The breaking point came in the spring of 1548. Parr, now pregnant for the first time at 35, walked into a room and found Seymour embracing Elizabeth. The details of that embrace are lost to history, but it was enough. Parr erupted. She confronted Seymour. She confronted Elizabeth, and then she made the coldest decision available to her. Elizabeth was told to leave. No explanation, no apology, no goodbye. Within days, the 14-year-old girl was packed off to a distant manor house with her servants and her books. She never saw Catherine Parr again. Parr died later that year, in September, from complications of childbirth. Thomas Seymour, freed from the restraint of his wife, began plotting against his brother, the Lord Protector. He was arrested, charged with treason, and executed the following year. Elizabeth was interrogated about her involvement with him. The investigators asked Kat Ashley whether the princess had ever been alone with Seymour, whether she had encouraged his attention, whether she was still a virgin. Ashley answered every question with steady, fierce loyalty. "No," she said. "The princess was innocent. The princess had done nothing wrong." Elizabeth herself wrote a letter to the Lord Protector that was a masterpiece of control. She was 15 years old, under suspicion, facing the possibility of imprisonment or worse, and her letter was calm, precise, and perfectly innocent. She acknowledged nothing. She apologized for nothing. She simply said she had heard rumors and found them ridiculous. The letter survived the investigation. She survived it. Seymour went to the block, and Elizabeth went back to her books, a little more hardened, a little more alone, and a little more certain that love and sex and proximity to power were a combination that could kill you. The next few years were quiet. Elizabeth retreated to her estates in the countryside. She read history, theology, and poetry. She translated texts from Greek into Latin and back again. She wrote letters to her brother, the king, always warm, always loyal. She attended Protestant services with visible devotion. She made no trouble. She made no enemies. And she waited. Edward VI died in July of 1553. He was 15 years old, and his lungs had been failing for months. On his deathbed, he made a decision that nearly destroyed the Tudor dynasty. Persuaded by his Protestant advisors, he wrote a new will that excluded both his half-sisters from the succession. Mary, he said, was a Catholic who would undo the Reformation. Elizabeth, though Protestant, was still legally a bastard and a threat if she married a foreign prince. Instead, Edward left the crown to his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, a 16-year-old Protestant girl who had been hastily married to the son of the Duke of Northumberland, the man pulling all the strings. Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen on July 10th. She wept when they told her. She said she did not want the crown, but her parents and her in-laws forced her to accept it. 9 days later, Mary Tudor rode into London at the head of an army of supporters, and the whole charade collapsed. Jane was thrown into the Tower. Northumberland was executed. Mary became Queen Mary I, and England had its first reigning queen. Elizabeth had stayed completely out of it. She had not spoken for Jane. She had not spoken against Mary. She waited at Hatfield, watching the couriers come and go, and when Mary's victory was certain, she wrote a letter of congratulations and rode out to join her sister's triumphal entry into London. They met at the city gates, two women who shared a father but almost nothing else, and they smiled at each other. Behind the smiles was a lifetime of resentment and fear. Mary was 37 years old. She had spent her entire adult life fighting for her legitimacy, her religion, and her right to exist. She saw Elizabeth, and she saw Anne Boleyn's daughter, the living reminder of the woman who had supplanted her mother. But Mary also remembered the little girl who had been sent away, the sister who had been declared a bastard just like she had been. For a brief moment, there was something like affection between them. It did not last. Mary set about restoring Catholicism with a fervour that alarmed even her own advisers. She repealed the Protestant laws of her brother's reign. She restored the Mass. She married Philip II of Spain, a Habsburg prince who was cold, formal, and deeply unpopular with the English people, and she began to look at Elizabeth with growing suspicion. The Protestants of England, the ones who did not want a Spanish king and a Catholic queen, were starting to whisper Elizabeth's name. The first crisis came in January of 1554. A group of rebels led by Sir Thomas Wyatt rose up in Kent, intending to march on London and depose Mary. Their demand, in part, was that Mary should be replaced with Elizabeth, who would be married to an English Protestant nobleman, Edward Courtenay. The rebellion never had a real chance. It was poorly organised, badly timed, and Mary's forces crushed it within weeks. Wyatt was captured, tortured, and eventually executed. But before he died, under interrogation, he mentioned Elizabeth. Nobody could prove Elizabeth knew anything about the rebellion. There were no letters, no meetings, no whispered conversations, but the very fact that her name had been invoked was enough. Mary's advisers urged her to arrest her sister. The Spanish ambassador, Simon Renard, was particularly insistent. He believed Elizabeth was a threat that would never go away. Mary hesitated. She did not want to kill her own sister, but she could not ignore the danger. On March 18th, 1554, a detachment of the Queen's Guard arrived at Ashridge, the manor house where Elizabeth had been staying. She was sick, genuinely sick, swollen with some kind of inflammation that made it almost impossible for her to walk. The guards told her she was being taken to London. She asked why. They did not answer. She asked if she could see the Queen. They said nothing. The journey took 5 days. They carried her in a litter because she was too weak to ride. The weather was miserable, cold rain soaking through the curtains. When they reached London, they did not take her to the palace. They took her to the river, to a set of stone steps leading down to the water. A barge was waiting. The boatman pushed off into the current, and Elizabeth saw the destination rising ahead of her, the Tower of London. The barge pulled up to a water gate cut into the outer wall of the fortress. It was called Traitors Gate. Every person in England knew what that gate meant. Anne Boleyn had passed through it. Thomas More, Catherine Howard. People who went through Traitors Gate did not always come out again. Elizabeth refused to step onto the landing. The rain was driving down now, cold and hard, and she sat in the barge and would not move. The guards shouted at her. She shouted back. Finally, she stepped onto the wet stone steps, and then she stopped again. She sat down on the stones, right there in the rain, and said she would not go any further. She was a loyal subject, she said. She had done nothing against the Queen. She would not enter the tower as a prisoner. The guards did not know what to do with a princess who refused to walk. They could not drag her. They could not beat her. So they waited, standing in the rain, while Elizabeth sat on the cold stone and let the water soak through her dress. After a long time, one of her gentleman attendants persuaded her to rise. She was shivering, her face pale and swollen. She walked through the gate, and the heavy doors swung shut behind her. She was placed in a suite of rooms in the royal apartments, not in a dungeon. The rooms were comfortable enough, but the windows looked out onto a courtyard where, 18 years earlier, her mother had walked to the scaffold. Elizabeth knew this. Everyone in the tower knew it. She spent her days reading and writing, and she spent her nights staring at the ceiling, waiting for footsteps in the corridor. The interrogations began within days. The Queen's counsellors came at her with questions. What did she know about Wyatt's rebellion? Had she communicated with Wyatt? Had she encouraged him? Elizabeth answered every question with a calm that was almost unnerving. No, she did not know Wyatt. No, she had never written to him. No, she had never plotted against the Queen. Her answers were so consistent, so measured, that the interrogators could find no crack. Simon Renard, the Spanish ambassador, grew frustrated. He wrote to Philip of Spain that Elizabeth was very clever and that she has a great deal of wit. While she was being questioned, Elizabeth was also writing to Mary. She sent letter after letter, each one carefully crafted. She declared her innocence. She swore her loyalty. She begged to be allowed to speak to the Queen in person. Mary did not answer. The silence was worse than any accusation. After 2 months in the Tower, the council concluded they had no evidence to hold her. Mary, reluctantly, agreed to release her. But Elizabeth was not free. She was transferred to house arrest at Woodstock, a crumbling old hunting lodge in Oxfordshire. The conditions were worse than the Tower. The house was damp and cold. She was allowed almost no visitors. Her books were restricted. She was watched constantly. Sir Henry Bedingfield, the knight assigned to guard her, was a stern Catholic who treated her with rigid suspicion. Elizabeth learned to hate him with a quiet, patient hatred that she would carry for years. The months dragged on. Elizabeth grew thin. She had headaches and stomach pains. She wrote more letters to Mary, some of them desperate, some of them dignified. No answer. She wrote to Philip of Spain, asking him to intercede. She read the Psalms. She walked in the small, muddy garden and counted the days. The change came slowly. Philip of Spain, pragmatic as always, began to see Elizabeth as an asset rather than a threat. Mary had not conceived a child, and it was becoming clear she probably never would. If Mary died without an heir, Elizabeth would be queen. Philip wanted Elizabeth to feel grateful to him when that day came, so he advised Mary to show her sister mercy. Mary, exhausted by a false pregnancy that had humiliated her publicly and physically, finally agreed. In the autumn of 1555, Elizabeth was summoned back to court. She travelled slowly, still weak, and when she arrived she was not embraced as a sister. She was made to wait. She was made to prove herself. But she was no longer a prisoner. She was back in the game. She played it perfectly. She attended Mass with visible, if restrained, devotion. She dressed simply. She did not speak of politics. She did not gather followers. She became, to all outward appearances, a quiet, obedient, and harmless young woman. Mary remained suspicious, but she could find no excuse to move against her. Elizabeth had learned, during those months at Woodstock, that survival was not about fighting back. It was about waiting. Waiting and watching and never, ever saying the thing that could be used against you. On November 17th, 1558, the waiting ended. Mary died at St. James's Palace in the early hours of the morning. She had been ill for months, probably from ovarian cancer, and her last weeks were spent in pain and despair. She had named Elizabeth as her successor with great reluctance, knowing there was no alternative. Elizabeth did not wait for the messenger to finish speaking. The moment she understood that Mary was dead and the crown was hers, she turned and walked out of the house into the cold November parkland at Hatfield. The sky was low and grey. The oak trees stood bare against the wind. She found a spot under one of them and knelt down on the frozen grass. No one recorded exactly which tree it was, but the story would be told for centuries afterward. The new queen on her knees in the dirt, speaking a line from the Psalms in Latin. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes." Then she stood up, brushed the leaves from her gown, and went back inside to start building a government. The first person she called was William Cecil. He had been waiting for this moment, ready, his mind already running through the lists of things that needed to be done. Elizabeth looked at him across the room. this thin, serious man with a beard already going grey, and she made him a promise and a demand at the same time. "I give you this charge," she said, "that you shall be of my privy council, and you will not be corrupted by any gift, and you will be faithful to the state." She did not add the words "or else," but they hung in the air anyway. Cecil nodded. He understood exactly who he was dealing with. This was not a young woman who needed a father figure. This was a sovereign who had spent 10 years learning to trust no one completely, and she was choosing to trust him. That trust would hold for 4 decades. Within hours, the machinery of succession began to turn. A messenger rode hard for London. Bells started ringing from church towers across the city. The great nobles who had served Mary began the awkward, urgent pivot toward the new regime. No one wanted to be the last to swear loyalty. Elizabeth, meanwhile, took her time. She stayed at Hatfield for nearly 2 weeks, assembling her council, reading through the state papers Cecil put in front of her, and writing letters in her own hand to foreign courts. Every word was chosen carefully. She was a 25-year-old unmarried woman taking the throne of a bankrupt, divided nation, and every king in Europe was watching to see if she would stumble. The journey to London was a procession. Elizabeth rode through villages and towns where people lined the roads, throwing caps in the air, shouting blessings, weeping with relief. Mary's reign had ended in famine, disease, and the smoking ruins of heretics burned at the stake. The new queen was young. She was Protestant. She was English to her bones. When she passed through the city gates, the crowds pressed so close that her guards struggled to keep a path open. Elizabeth did not shrink from them. She reached out from her horse and touched people's hands. She smiled. She made eye contact. It was a performance, yes, but it was also genuine. She loved this country, and she wanted the country to love her back. The coronation was set for January the 15th, 1559, a date chosen by her astrologer, John Dee, after careful calculation. The night before, Elizabeth rode from the Tower of London to Westminster in an open litter, wearing a gown of cloth of gold, a cape of ermine, and a crown of gold set with pearls. Torches lit the streets. Pageants were staged along the route. At one point, a child dressed as an angel handed her a Bible. Elizabeth took it, kissed it, and held it to her chest while the crowd roared. At another point, a woman from the crowd pushed forward and gave her a sprig of rosemary. Elizabeth kept it in her hand for the rest of the procession. Inside Westminster Abbey the next morning, the ceremony was a careful balancing act. The bishop who performed the anointing was Catholic. The ritual was ancient, in Latin, heavy with incense, but Elizabeth had made small, deliberate changes. The elevation of the host was skipped. The prayers were tweaked. She took the coronation oath, promising to govern according to the laws of England, and then she disappeared behind a screen to be stripped to the waist and anointed with holy oil. When she emerged, the heavy crown of St. Edward was placed on her head. It weighed nearly 5 pounds. She wore it for the rest of the day without flinching. The first test of her reign came immediately. Mary's bishops, nearly all of them Catholics appointed by Rome, refused to cooperate. Only one bishop, the Bishop of Carlisle, agreed to crown her. The rest stood back with folded arms. Elizabeth did not waste time arguing. She let them sulk, and then she replaced them. One by one, the old bishops were removed from their posts, and new men who could accept the royal supremacy, were installed. It was quiet, methodical, and ruthless in the way that Elizabeth would be ruthless for the rest of her reign. Never with a public execution unless absolutely necessary, but always with the door closing firmly behind you. The religious settlement took shape over the spring of 1559. The Act of Supremacy restored the Church of England's independence from Rome, but Elizabeth refused the title of Supreme Head. She chose instead Supreme Governor, a softer word, a woman's word, a word that left room for people who struggled with the idea of a female head of the Church. The Act of Uniformity brought back the Book of Common Prayer, the same Protestant prayer book that had been used under Edward, but with a crucial edit. The most offensive anti-papal passages were removed. Communion was left deliberately ambiguous. The bread and wine could be understood as the body and blood of Christ, or as a memorial. Elizabeth's position was clear without being sharp. She told her council that she did not wish to make windows into men's souls. What people believed in the privacy of their own hearts was their business. What they did in church on Sunday morning was hers. Not everyone was satisfied. The Puritans wanted a more radical reformation, stripped of every Catholic vestige. The Catholics wanted the Mass back and the Pope restored. But for the great mass of English people, the settlement was enough. It was a middle path, and it held. Elizabeth had looked at the continent, at France tearing itself apart in religious civil war, at Spain's Inquisition, at the burnings her own sister had authorized, and she chose a different way, not because she was soft, because she was practical. Foreign policy crowded in fast. Scotland, just across the northern border, was ruled by Mary of Guise, the French mother of Mary Stuart, the young woman who many Catholics believed was the true Queen of England. Mary Stuart had been raised in the French court. She had married the French king, Francis II, and she had allowed her coat of arms to be quartered with the arms of England, a declaration that she, not Elizabeth, was the rightful sovereign. The French fleet patrolled the Channel. French troops were stationed in Scotland. England was caught in a vice. Elizabeth did not have the money for a war. The treasury Mary left behind was empty. The crown owed debts to foreign bankers at ruinous interest rates. So she did what she would do many times over the next 40 years. She stalled. She sent diplomats. She made vague promises. She authorized just enough support to the Scottish Protestant rebels to keep the French busy without committing to open conflict. It was a dangerous game, but it worked. In the summer of 1560, the Treaty of Edinburgh sent the French troops home and recognized Elizabeth's right to the English throne. Mary Stuart refused to ratify it, but her refusal was a piece of paper, not an army. For the moment, the northern border was quiet. Now her own parliament came for her. And they came with the one demand she had been dreading. The House of Commons presented a formal petition begging her to marry. They were polite, they were deferential, but the message was unmistakable. A woman alone on the throne was an invitation to chaos. If she died without an heir, the country would fall into civil war. If she married a foreign prince, England might become a province of some continental empire. If she married an English nobleman, she would elevate one family above all others and ignite factional bloodshed. The only solution, in their view, was for her to choose wisely and choose soon. Produce a child, secure the line. Elizabeth listened to their petition with a face that gave nothing away. Then she answered, and her answer was a masterpiece of evasion. She thanked them for their concern. She acknowledged that she was, in fact, a woman, and that she understood why they worried. But she reminded them that she had been crowned with the oil of an anointed sovereign, and that in the end she would be judged by God alone. She said she was not opposed to marriage in principle. She might, at some point, in the fullness of time, consider it, but she would not be rushed. And then she held up her hand and pointed to the coronation ring on her finger. "I am already bound unto a husband," she said, "which is the kingdom of England." The Commons withdrew, baffled and unsatisfied, but they could not force her, and Elizabeth had bought herself time. She spent that time with Robert Dudley. He had been in her life as long as she could remember, the son of the Duke of Northumberland who had been executed for putting Jane Grey on the throne. Dudley had been imprisoned in the Tower alongside Elizabeth. He had known her in the dark days. Now she made him Master of the Horse, a position that required him to be at her side constantly, organising her travels, attending her on public occasions, sleeping in rooms adjacent to her own. He was tall, dark-haired, athletic, a superb horseman, a man who made other men jealous just by walking into a room, and Elizabeth adored him. The rumours started within weeks. The ambassadors of Spain and France wrote letters home filled with speculation. The Venetian ambassador reported that Dudley had free access to the Queen's bedchamber at all hours. The English courtiers whispered that the Queen was in love, that she spent every private moment with Dudley, that she touched his arm in public and laughed at his jokes in a way that suggested more. Elizabeth did nothing to stop the talk. If anything, she seemed to enjoy it. Let them wonder, but she was also using her single status as a diplomatic tool. Marriage negotiations opened with some of the most eligible men in Europe. Archduke Charles of Austria, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, sent envoys to sound out a match. Elizabeth entertained them warmly, asked detailed questions about the Archduke's health and temperament, and then let the talks drag on for months without making a single commitment. King Eric XIV of Sweden sent diamonds, furs, and love letters. Elizabeth kept the gifts and answered the letters with teasing politeness. She told the Swedish ambassador that his master was a fine man, but she was not ready to leave her kingdom for a foreign throne. The truth was simpler. She did not want to leave England. She did not want to share power. And she did not want to stop being the centre of attention. Then, in September of 1560, the whole delicate arrangement exploded. Amy Robsart, Dudley's wife, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in a country house in Oxfordshire. She had been staying there with friends while Dudley remained at court. The morning of September 8th, she sent all her servants away to a fair in a nearby town. When they returned, she was lying at the foot of the stairs with her neck broken. The house was empty. There were no witnesses. The news hit the court like a thunderclap. Dudley went pale when he heard. Elizabeth immediately ordered an investigation. But the damage was done before the first witness was questioned. Everyone in Europe assumed the same thing. Dudley had murdered his wife to clear the path to the Queen's bed. The Spanish ambassador wrote that it was a scandal beyond anything he had seen. The French king joked that the Queen of England was going to marry her horsekeeper after he had conveniently disposed of his inconvenient spouse. The Protestant reformers who had hoped for a marriage with a foreign prince were horrified. The English nobility, who already resented Dudley's closeness to the throne, were furious. The inquest returned a verdict of accidental death. Amy Robsart, they said, had fallen down the stairs and broken her neck. There were no signs of a struggle. The staircase was steep and narrow. The verdict was legally sound but politically useless. No one believed it, and Elizabeth, watching the storm from the centre of the whirlwind, understood something with cold clarity. She could never marry Robert Dudley now. Not after this. To marry the man whose wife had died under such suspicious circumstances would confirm every slander, every whisper, every filthy rumour that had followed her since her mother's execution. Her reputation would never recover. Her throne would be fatally weakened. Love, she realised, was a luxury that queens could not afford. She did not send Dudley away. She kept him at court, kept him close, kept him hoping. But the door that had been cracked open was now shut and bolted. She would love him for the rest of his life, and she would never let him touch the crown. And then, in October of 1562, the nightmare that Elizabeth had kept at bay for 3 years finally found her. It began with a fever. Nothing unusual. The autumn was cold and wet, and half the court was coughing. But within a day, the fever had spiked alarmingly high. Red spots appeared on her skin. The royal physicians examined her and went silent. Smallpox. The same disease that had killed thousands, that scarred the faces of the survivors, that did not care whether you were a peasant or a queen. Elizabeth was moved to her bed at Hampton Court. The curtains were drawn. The candles were lit. For 3 days, she burned. The pustules spread across her face, her neck, her arms. Her throat swelled until she could barely swallow. The physicians bled her, applied poultices, prayed. Nothing worked. By the 4th day, she had slipped into unconsciousness. Her breathing was so shallow that the ladies clustered around the bed had to lean close to hear it. In the room next door, the Privy Council met in emergency session. William Cecil was there, his face grey with exhaustion and fear. The other councillors argued in low, urgent voices. Who would rule if she died? The Protestant lords wanted Lady Catherine Grey, the sister of the executed Jane, a young woman of impeccable Protestant credentials. The Catholic faction whispered about Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scotland, the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. No one mentioned the Pope's preference. No one had to. The debate grew heated. Voices were raised. Cecil, for once, had no answer. He had spent 4 years building this reign, and now it was slipping away in a fever dream on the other side of the wall. He sat down and put his head in his hands. At some point in the depths of the coma, Elizabeth's lips moved. Her ladies leaned in. She was mumbling something. A name. Robert Dudley. Cat Ashley, who had been with her since childhood and was now her chief gentlewoman, took a ring from the Queen's finger, the coronation ring, and pressed it into her palm. It was a gesture of comfort, but also of preparation. If the Queen died, that ring would be taken to the council as proof. Then, on the morning of the 6th day, Elizabeth opened her eyes. She asked for water. She looked around the room and demanded to know why everyone was crying. The fever had broken. She was going to live. The recovery was slow. The scars on her face were not as severe as the doctors had feared, but they were there, pitted marks on her cheeks and forehead. Elizabeth studied them in a mirror, and never again appeared in public without the heavy white makeup that would become her signature. More than the scars, though, the illness changed something inside her. The council had debated her death as if she were already gone. They had argued about her successor while she lay breathing in the next room. She had been reminded, in the starkest possible terms, that her life was the only thing standing between England and chaos. When she was strong enough to receive visitors, Cecil came to her bedside. He knelt and told her the council had been meeting. Elizabeth looked at him with eyes that were still bruised and hollow. "I know what you were discussing," she said, "and I am not dead yet." The pressure to marry intensified to a point that bordered on harassment. Parliament sent another delegation. The bishops preached sermons on the duty of queens to bear children. The ambassadors renewed their offers with fresh urgency. Elizabeth listened to all of it, nodded, smiled, and did nothing. She had looked into the abyss and come back, and she knew now with absolute certainty that she would not hand her power to any man. Not Dudley, not an archduke, not a king. The crown was hers, and hers alone. She began to speak differently about herself. She started using the language of virginity, of mystical marriage to the realm. "I am married to England," she said, and it was not a metaphor. It was a political strategy, a shield, and a way of making sense of a life that had taken her from bastard child to anointed queen. She had survived the Tower, survived the interrogations, survived smallpox, survived the woman who tried to kill her. She would survive this too, and she would do it without a husband. She stood in front of the mirror in her private chambers, the scars still fresh on her skin, and she said it to herself, quietly, a promise and a warning. I will never belong to anyone. But if she was not going to be a wife, she had to be something else, something bigger, something that made people forget she was a woman alone on a throne. She had to become a goddess. Elizabeth emerged from the smallpox crisis with her body scarred and her resolve hardened. She was 30 years old, unmarried, childless, and surrounded by men who believed she was one bad fever away from plunging the country into civil war. A weaker woman might have crumbled. Elizabeth did something else entirely. She took the thing that made her most vulnerable, her female body, her singleness, her refusal to produce an heir, and she turned it into the most potent political weapon in Europe. She became the Virgin Queen. The title was not just a metaphor. It was a carefully constructed identity, layered with religious and mythological meaning. England, in the years after the break from Rome, had lost the Virgin Mary as an object of popular devotion. The shrines had been smashed. The statues had been pulled down. Into that devotional vacuum stepped Elizabeth. She did not encourage idolatry, but she did not discourage comparisons. Poets began writing about her in language that echoed the old prayers. She was Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice. She was Diana, the huntress. She was Gloriana, the fairy queen of Spenser's great poem. She was married to her kingdom, and her children were the people of England. The physical expression of this myth was the portrait. Elizabeth understood the power of the image more clearly than any monarch before her. She established strict control over how she was depicted. Every painting, every woodcut, every miniature had to be approved by her council. The portraits show a woman who never aged. Her skin is smooth and white. Her hair is golden red. Her gowns are encrusted with pearls and jewels that carry symbolic weight. Pearls for virginity, ermine for purity. A sieve in one famous portrait, held like a scepter, referencing the Roman Vestal Virgin who proved her chastity by carrying water in a sieve. The most famous of all, the rainbow portrait, painted near the end of her reign but embodying a lifetime of image-making, shows her holding a rainbow in her hand. The inscription reads, "Non sine sol iris." No rainbow without the sun. She was the sun, the source of light, the center of the universe. Even the calendar was pressed into the work. The 17th of November, the day Mary had died and Elizabeth had become queen, turned over the years into a national holiday, marked across England with bells and bonfires and thanksgiving in the churches, a kind of secular saint's day for a living monarch. At court, the day was celebrated with a tilt, a great chivalric tournament in which the finest young men of the realm rode against one another in the lists, dressed in fantastical armour and costumes, each one presenting himself before the Queen with a little allegorical speech or device in her honour. One knight might come as a wandering pilgrim, another as a prisoner of love, each of them performing his devotion to the woman watching from the gallery. It was theatre as much as sport, and it existed to say one thing over and over in front of ambassadors and crowds, that the greatest men in England lived to serve this one aging, unmarried woman, and counted it the highest honour of their lives. The cult of the Queen was not confined to canvas. Every summer, Elizabeth went on progress. She would pack up the entire court, hundreds of people, wagons loaded with furniture and tapestries and gowns, and travel through the English countryside, staying at the great houses of her nobility. These progresses were part vacation, part public relations campaign, and part political audit. The Queen rode on horseback through market towns and villages, and people who would never in their lives come within 100 miles of London got to see her face. They pressed forward to hand her petitions. They knelt in the mud as she passed. She stopped and spoke to them. She remembered names. She accepted bouquets of wildflowers and bunches of rosemary from women who wept to be near her. The same iron underneath the charm showed itself in how she handled her own church. By the mid-1570s, her religious settlement was being strained from the Protestant side by preachers who wanted to push reform further than she would allow. When gatherings called prophesying sprang up, meetings where ministers came together to expound scripture, Elizabeth distrusted them as breeding grounds for zeal and disorder, and she ordered her Archbishop of Canterbury, Edmund Grindal, to shut them down. Grindal was a sincere and gentle man, and he refused. He wrote her a long, brave letter telling her that she could not command men's consciences, and that in matters of religion she ought to defer to her bishops. No one told Elizabeth what she could not command. She suspended her own archbishop from the running of his office, and left him in a kind of internal exile for the rest of his life, and he died still under her displeasure, never restored. It was a quiet, hard reminder that when she had refused the title of Supreme Head and taken Supreme Governor instead, she had not been giving anything away. The Church of England answered to her, Archbishop and all. Hosting the Queen was an honour that could bankrupt a noble family. Lord Burghley once calculated that a visit from Elizabeth cost a host upwards of £2,000, a staggering sum in the 1570s. But refusing to host was unthinkable. Elizabeth expected to be entertained with masques, with plays, with hunting parties, with elaborate banquets served on silver plate. She expected gifts. She expected the best bedchamber in the house, hung with the finest tapestries. She expected her hosts to tear down walls and build new wings if necessary. And they did it. Because proximity to the Queen was power. At court, Elizabeth cultivated an atmosphere of romantic devotion. She was in her late 30s, then her 40s, but she still expected the men around her to court her, as if she were a young bride. They wrote her love poems. They fought mock duels over who could carry her glove. They wore her colours. She danced with them, flirted with them, played one against another, and then withdrew before anything could become serious. It was a game, but it was a game with high stakes. A man who forgot his place could find himself in the tower. The men who understood the game could rise very far playing it. Christopher Hatton first caught the Queen's eye as a young man dancing at court, and he rose on the strength of it, from a minor gentleman to captain of her personal bodyguard, and, in the end, to Lord Chancellor of England, the highest legal office in the land, despite having barely practiced law in his life. He never married. He spent his career styling himself the Queen's devoted servant, writing her letters so full of adoration that a stranger reading them would think they were love letters, which, in a strange, bloodless way, they were. He grew jealous when other men climbed into her favour. He built one of the greatest houses in England, partly in the hope she would come and stay in it. Elizabeth understood exactly what she was doing to men like Hatton, keeping them half in love and wholly dependent, and she did it with her eyes open, because a court full of men competing for her affection was a court she controlled completely. Robert Dudley remained at the centre of that court. He was the master of the horse, the Earl of Leicester, the Queen's favourite, the man everyone assumed she would marry if she ever married anyone. He had become the Earl of Leicester in a way that told you everything about how strangely Elizabeth handled the men she loved. In the years after the smallpox, she had come up with an extraordinary scheme for solving two problems at once. Mary Stuart, up in Scotland, was looking for a husband, and every candidate Elizabeth could imagine was a threat, a foreign prince who might turn Scotland into a dagger pointed at England. So Elizabeth offered Mary the one man in the world she trusted completely. She offered her, Robert Dudley. To make the offer seem less like an insult, she raised him to the peerage, creating him Earl of Leicester in a grand ceremony at Westminster. The Scottish ambassador, watching, later swore that as she fastened the robes of nobility on Dudley, kneeling in front of her, the Queen could not resist reaching down and tickling his neck. Then she turned to the ambassador, showed him a little portrait of Dudley she kept, and asked him, half teasing and half in earnest, whether his mistress would like such a man. Mary was deeply offended at being offered Elizabeth's own cast-off favourite, and she married someone else. And Dudley stayed exactly where he had always been, at Elizabeth's side, a little grander now, and no closer to the crown than before. But the years passed, and she did not marry him. Dudley grew restless. He wanted an heir. He wanted the respect that came with a legitimate family. Elizabeth kept him dangling, never quite releasing him, never quite claiming him. It was a kind of cruelty, and she knew it. In the summer of 1575, Dudley made his last great attempt to change her mind, and he made it on a scale England had never seen. He invited her to Kenilworth, the castle in Warwickshire she had given him years earlier, and he spent a fortune preparing for the visit. He built a whole new wing of apartments so she would have rooms worthy of her. He dammed a valley to widen the lake, he stocked the grounds with game, and then he kept her there for 19 days, longer than she stayed anywhere else in her entire reign. Every day brought a new spectacle. When she rode across the causeway on the first evening, a figure costumed as the Lady of the Lake floated toward her on an island that seemed to move by itself, welcoming her with verses written for the occasion. The great clock on the keep was stopped, its hands frozen at the hour of her arrival, so that time itself would appear to stand still while she was in residence. There were hunts and banquets that ran late into the night, and fireworks that lit up the water and could be heard, people said, 20 miles away. One evening a man swam out onto the lake dressed as a mythical singer riding on the back of a dolphin, and sang to her across the dark water. Underneath all of it ran a single question, and everyone at Kenilworth knew what it was. The pageants had been written to ask her, again and again, in the language of myth and flattery, to stay, to yield, to marry the man who had built all this for her. On the last day, one of the costumed characters was named Deep Desire, and his whole part was to beg her not to leave. She watched the performance to the end, she thanked her host, and then she rode away, having said nothing at all about marriage. Dudley had spent everything he had, and he had his answer. He never asked her so directly again. In 1578, Dudley did something that shattered the arrangement. He married Lettice Knollys. Lettice was the daughter of Elizabeth's own cousin, a tall, red-haired, strikingly beautiful woman who had served as one of the Queen's ladies. She was also, and this was the part that cut deepest, the granddaughter of Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister. Lettice had Boleyn blood. She looked like Elizabeth. She moved like Elizabeth. And now she had married the man Elizabeth loved. Dudley kept the marriage secret for over a year. When Elizabeth found out, the rage was volcanic. She screamed at her counsellors. She banished Lettice from court. She called her a she-wolf, a name that stuck. She refused to see her, refused to speak her name, refused to acknowledge the marriage in any way. When Dudley tried to smooth things over, she turned her back on him. It took months before she allowed him back into her presence, and even then, things were never the same. The door that had been cracked open since Amy Robsart's death was now not just closed but sealed. Dudley would remain her friend, her advisor, her constant companion in public. But the dream, whatever was left of it, was dead. The arts flourished under Elizabeth's reign in ways that still echo. The theatre, which had been a rough, semi-respectable entertainment in the inn yards of London, became an institution. In 1576, the first purpose-built playhouse, called simply The Theatre, opened in Shoreditch. Others followed. The Curtain, the Rose, and then, in 1599, the Globe. A young man from Stratford-upon-Avon named William Shakespeare arrived in London in the late 1580s and began writing plays that captured the energy and ambition of the age. Christopher Marlowe, his contemporary, wrote Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine, plays full of soaring language and dangerous ideas. Edmund Spenser published The Faerie Queen in 1590, dedicating it to Elizabeth, and she rewarded him with a pension of £50 a year. The poet John Lyly wrote Euphues, a novel so influential that an entire style of ornate speech was named after it. The court became a centre of literary patronage. Elizabeth herself translated classical texts in her private hours, keeping her Latin sharp and her mind engaged. All of this, the portraits, the progresses, the poetry, the plays, served a single purpose. It made the Queen seem timeless. It made her seem inevitable. It made people forget that she was a woman in her 40s, with no husband and no child, and that the entire Tudor experiment rested on her pulse. There was one final marriage negotiation, the strangest of them all. In 1579, the Duke of Alençon, the youngest son of Catherine de' Medici of France, began courting Elizabeth in earnest. He was 24 years old. She was 46. He was short, pockmarked, and had a nose that had been described by unkind observers as being divided in two by a deep cleft. Elizabeth called him her frog. She seemed genuinely charmed by him. He crossed the Channel to visit her, the only foreign suitor who ever did, and she spent 2 weeks with him at Greenwich, dancing, walking in the gardens, talking for hours. She gave him a ring. She kissed him in public. She told her council that she was seriously considering the match. The council was horrified. The prospect of a French Catholic consort, a man young enough to be her son, a man whose mother had orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of Protestants in Paris, was too much. Preachers denounced the match from the pulpit. Pamphlets circulated warning that England would become a French province. Elizabeth, who had spent 2 decades avoiding marriage by pretending to consider it, may have actually been on the verge of saying yes this time. Or she may have been playing the same game she had always played. No one can know for certain. What is known is that in the end, she withdrew. She told Alençon she could not marry him. He returned to France, heartbroken, and died 2 years later of a fever. Elizabeth wept when she heard the news. She dressed in black and told her ladies that she would never marry now. The door, which had been closing inch by inch for 20 years, clicked shut for the final time. But while Elizabeth had been dancing with frogs and building her mythology, a much more dangerous story had been unfolding in the north. In 1568, a woman had crossed the Scottish border into England. She was 25 years old, tall, beautiful, auburn-haired, and she was a Catholic queen without a throne. Mary Stuart had been forced to abdicate by her own nobles, imprisoned in a castle on an island in the middle of a loch, and had escaped in a fishing boat, crossing the Solway Firth under cover of darkness. She threw herself on Elizabeth's mercy, asking for protection, for an army, for restoration to her throne. Elizabeth did not know what to do with her. Mary was an anointed queen. The idea of handing her over to the Scottish rebels was distasteful. But Mary was also the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, the widow of the French king, and the most legitimate Catholic claimant to the English throne. As long as she was free, she was a magnet for every plotter, every assassin, every foreign power that wanted to see Elizabeth dead and England returned to Rome. The decision Elizabeth made was characteristic. She refused to decide. Mary was placed under house arrest, moved from castle to castle in the English Midlands, always in comfortable conditions, always attended by servants, always watched. She was not allowed to travel. She was not allowed to meet with supporters. She was not a prisoner in a dungeon. She was a guest who could never leave, and Elizabeth refused to meet her. For 19 years, the two queens, cousins by blood, rivals by circumstance, never once laid eyes on each other. They communicated through letters, through ambassadors, through the filter of their counselors. Mary wrote passionate, angry, pleading letters. Elizabeth wrote cautious, evasive, sometimes cruel replies. It was a relationship conducted entirely in ink, and it grew more poisonous with every passing year. Before she settled Mary into that long, comfortable imprisonment, Elizabeth tried to find a legal way through the problem, and the attempt tells you a great deal about how her mind worked. In the winter of 1568, she convened a formal inquiry, first at York and then at Westminster, to examine the charges the Scottish lords had brought against their former queen. The lords arrived with evidence. They produced a silver casket said to contain letters and sonnets in Mary's own hand, love letters and worse, that seemed to tie her to the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley, blown up and strangled in a garden in Edinburgh 2 years before. Elizabeth read the situation with cold precision. If she let the inquiry find Mary guilty, she would be endorsing the right of subjects to depose and destroy an anointed queen, which was the last principle on earth she wanted to establish. But if she found Mary innocent, she would be obliged to send an English army into Scotland to force the rebel lords to take their queen back, and she had no intention of spending that money or that blood. So she did what she did best. She arranged for the inquiry to end in nothing. The verdict, when it came, found that nothing had been proven against the Scottish lords, and nothing had been proven against Mary either. No one was guilty. No one was cleared. The casket letters were handed back, and in time they vanished from history altogether, so that scholars still argue about whether they were genuine, forged, or something in between. Mary remained exactly where Elizabeth wanted her, neither condemned nor free, suspended in a silence that would last the rest of her life. The danger was not imaginary. In 1569, a group of Catholic nobles from the north of England rose in rebellion. Their plan was simple: march south, free Mary, and put her on the throne. The Rising of the North, as it came to be called, attracted thousands of followers. They marched under banners depicting the wounds of Christ. They celebrated Mass in Durham Cathedral, which had not seen a Catholic service in a decade. Elizabeth's response was swift and brutal. She sent an army north. The rebellion was crushed. Hundreds of rebels were hanged. More than 800, by the count of one contemporary, were executed in the aftermath. Elizabeth ordered that the bodies be left hanging in chains at crossroads as a warning. The message was clear. She would not tolerate threats to her throne, even if she had to turn the north of England into a charnel house. The following year, in 1570, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull called Regnans in Excelsis. It declared Elizabeth a heretic and a usurper. It excommunicated her from the Catholic Church. And, most dangerously, it released all English Catholics from any oath of allegiance to her. A Catholic who killed Elizabeth, the Pope implied, would be doing God's work. The effect was immediate and devastating. English Catholics, who had mostly kept their heads down and attended the Church of England with quiet resentment, were suddenly defined as potential traitors. The government cracked down. Priests who entered England secretly from the continent were hunted by pursuivants, the Queen's agents. Being a Catholic became, in the eyes of the law, a political crime. Elizabeth needed a man who could protect her from the shadows. She found him in Francis Walsingham. Walsingham became Secretary of State in 1573, and he brought with him a mind that functioned like a spider's web. He recruited agents across Europe. He intercepted letters. He cracked codes. He turned servants into informants. He built the most sophisticated intelligence network that England had ever known. His agents penetrated the French embassy, the Spanish court, and eventually the household of Mary Stuart herself. Walsingham uncovered plot after plot. In 1571, the Ridolfi plot planned to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne with Spanish troops. The Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful men in England, was implicated. He was tried for treason and executed. Elizabeth signed his death warrant, then revoked it, then signed it again. She hated executing nobles. It reminded her too much of her mother, but she did it anyway. In 1583, Walsingham broke the Throckmorton plot, another scheme involving Spanish troops, French money, and Mary Stuart's blessing. The young man at the centre of it, Francis Throckmorton, was tortured on the rack until he confessed everything. He was executed, and the evidence against Mary grew thicker. The following year, the danger came very close to home in a way that frightened even the hardened men around the Queen. In the summer of 1584, William of Orange, the leader of the Protestant Dutch, was shot dead in his own house by a Catholic assassin who had talked his way into the household. It was the first time in living memory that a head of state had been killed by a lone gunman with a pistol, and the lesson was not lost on anyone in London. If it could happen to William, it could happen to Elizabeth. Walsingham and Cecil answered with an extraordinary document called the Bond of Association. It bound everyone who signed it to hunt down and kill anyone who attempted to harm the Queen, and, more chillingly, to kill anyone in whose name or for whose benefit such an attempt was made. The target was obvious. It was Mary. Thousands of Englishmen signed it, some of them pressing their own seals into the wax with real fervour, swearing a personal oath of vengeance on behalf of a woman most of them would never meet. It was less a law than a nation promising, in advance, to commit murder if its queen was touched. Then, in early 1585, a member of Parliament named William Parry was arrested and charged with plotting to shoot Elizabeth in her own garden. He confessed, recanted, confessed again, and went to the scaffold protesting that he had never truly meant it. Whatever the truth of Parry, the effect was to push through a new law, the Act for the Queen's Safety, which finally gave the Bond of Association legal teeth. From that point on, if any plot was made in Mary's name, Mary herself could be tried and put to death for it. Whether she had lifted a finger or not, the net had been woven around her. All that remained was for her to walk into it. Elizabeth lived with the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was almost always plotting to kill her. She wore gloves constantly. She had her food tasted. She slept in a different bed than the one she was expected to sleep in. She was a woman who had been hunted since childhood, and the hunt never really stopped. But she would not kill Mary. Her counsellors begged her. Parliament passed laws demanding Mary's execution. Elizabeth refused. It was not sentimentality. It was calculation. Mary was an anointed queen. If Elizabeth set the precedent that anointed queens could be executed, she was teaching the world that anointed queens could be executed. She was making herself mortal, and beyond the principle, there was the practical reality. If she killed Mary, Spain would have a martyr and a reason for war. Elizabeth was not ready for war with Spain, not yet. So the stalemate continued. Mary moved from castle to castle. Her health deteriorated. She wrote letters in code, hidden in beer barrels, sewn into the hems of dresses, smuggled out by sympathetic servants. She became more desperate, and in the summer of 1586, she made the mistake that would finally cost her everything. A young Catholic gentleman named Anthony Babington wrote Mary a letter. He had assembled a small group of conspirators. Their plan was to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Babington asked for Mary's blessing. Mary, after years of frustration and isolation, wrote back. She did not explicitly endorse assassination, but she acknowledged the plan. She discussed the details. She put her response in writing. The letter never reached Babington. Walsingham's agents intercepted it. They had been watching Babington for months. They had been reading his correspondence the whole time. The whole secret channel Mary thought she had was Walsingham's invention from the start. He had arranged, through a double agent, for her letters to be smuggled in and out of her latest prison inside the bung of a beer barrel, a hidden waterproof packet slipped in with the weekly delivery. Mary believed it was a lucky, private line to the outside world that her jailers knew nothing about. In fact, every letter that went into that barrel and every letter that came out of it passed first across Walsingham's desk, was opened, copied, decoded, and sealed again before it moved on. He had built her a trap out of the one thing she wanted most, a way to keep plotting, and then he simply waited for her to write the words that would hang her. The letter was brought to Walsingham's office, where his cryptographers decoded Mary's cipher. At the bottom of the page, Walsingham drew a small gallows. It was his signal. He had the proof he needed. Babington and his co-conspirators were arrested. They were tried for treason. Their execution was public and gruesome. They were hanged, cut down while still alive, disemboweled and quartered. The crowd watched in silence. Elizabeth had ordered that the spectacle be drawn out as long as possible, as a warning. And then the council turned to Mary. The trial began in October of 1586. Mary defended herself with intelligence and dignity, but the evidence was overwhelming. The letters were in her own hand. The cipher was hers. The seal was hers. The judges found her guilty of treason and sentenced her to death. The sentence was passed to Elizabeth for her signature. The death warrant sat on Elizabeth's desk for months. She signed it. She unsaid the order. She looked at it, put it away, took it out again, and asked her counsellors over and over whether there was any other way. There was no other way. Mary Stuart had been found guilty of plotting the assassination of a crowned queen. The law demanded her life. The council demanded her life. Parliament demanded her life. Elizabeth alone resisted. The woman who had built her reign on the myth of the virgin goddess now had to decide whether to become the killer of another queen. She resisted because she understood something her advisors did not. Killing a queen was not like killing a nobleman. Every anointed sovereign in Europe would see the precedent. If Elizabeth Tudor could sign the death warrant of Mary Stuart, then any future rebel could sign the death warrant of any future monarch. Divine right, the mystical protection that surrounded the throne, would crack. And there was something else, something more personal. Elizabeth had spent her whole life as a target. She had been imprisoned in the Tower. She had been hunted by assassins. She knew what it felt like to wait for the axe. She could not easily become the person holding it. She tried to shift the burden. She suggested that Mary's jailer, Sir Amias Paulet, might quietly resolve the problem without a formal execution. Paulet, a stern Puritan, back with cold dignity, he would not murder a woman in his care. He was a gentleman, not a hired killer. Elizabeth raged at him for being, as she put it, too scrupulous. But she must have known somewhere underneath the anger that Paulet was right. She could not have Mary killed in secret. It had to be public. It had to be legal. It had to be her. On February 1st, 1587, Elizabeth signed the warrant. She handed it to her secretary, William Davison, with instructions that it should not be sealed. She wanted to think about it more. Davison, confused and terrified of making the wrong move, took the warrant to the Privy Council. The councillors saw their chance. They sealed the warrant themselves. They sent it to Fotheringhay Castle that same night. They did not wait for Elizabeth to change her mind again. Mary Stuart went to her death on the morning of February 8th. She wore a black satin gown over a red petticoat, the colour of Catholic martyrdom. She walked into the great hall of Fotheringhay, where a scaffold had been erected, draped in black cloth. 300 people were gathered to watch. Mary prayed in Latin. She forgave the executioner. She laid her head on the block. The first blow missed the neck and struck the back of her skull. The second blow severed the head. The executioner picked it up by the red hair and said, "God save the Queen." The hair came away in his hand. Mary had been wearing a wig over her own grey, cropped hair. When the news reached London, church bells rang. Bonfires were lit. The city celebrated. And Elizabeth, alone in her chambers at Greenwich, collapsed. She screamed. She wept. She called her counsellors murderers. She blamed them all. She banished Davison from her presence for the rest of his life. She wrote a long, anguished letter to James VI of Scotland, Mary's son, swearing that his mother's death had been an accident, a terrible mistake, that her council had acted without her knowledge. James, who had been negotiating secretly with Elizabeth for years to secure his own succession to the English throne, accepted the apology with cold practicality. He protested. He made a show of anger, but he did not break the alliance. He wanted to be king of England someday. A dead mother was a political inconvenience, not a catastrophe. Elizabeth wore black for weeks. She could not eat. She could not sleep. She sat in the dark with her ladies and said almost nothing. The woman who had built her reputation on being unbreakable was breaking, but there was no time to grieve. Across the Channel, Philip II of Spain had reached the limit of his patience. Mary Stuart had been the last obstacle holding him back. Now she was dead. The Catholic claimant was gone. The only way to bring England back to Rome was by force. Philip began assembling the largest fleet Europe had ever seen. He called it the Most Fortunate Navy. The Spanish called it the Invincible Armada. The war had been building for a long time. English privateers, licensed in all but name by Elizabeth to raid Spanish shipping, had been plundering treasure galleons for years, and the Queen quietly took a share of the plunder. The boldest of them was Francis Drake, a farmer's son from Devon who had gone to sea and turned piracy into an instrument of state. Between 1577 and 1580 he sailed all the way around the world, the first Englishman ever to do it, raiding Spanish ports and ships along the coast of the Americas as he went, and he came home with his hold so heavy with stolen silver and gold that the treasure paid off a large part of the crown's debts on its own. Philip of Spain demanded that the pirate be punished and the treasure returned. Elizabeth answered by going down to Deptford, boarding Drake's ship the Golden Hind in front of a crowd, and knighting him on his own deck, turning a wanted criminal into Sir Francis Drake while the Spanish ambassador stood and watched. It was a deliberate insult, and Philip understood it perfectly. Then Elizabeth sent troops to the Netherlands to support Protestant rebels fighting against Spanish rule. That intervention cost her dearly and won her little. She put Dudley himself in command of the expedition, and he made a mess of it, quarrelling with the Dutch, overspending, and accepting a grand title she had never authorised, which enraged her. The campaign's one immortal moment was a death. At a skirmish near the town of Zutphen, Sir Philip Sidney, poet, courtier, the brightest ornament of the whole Elizabethan age, and everything a gentleman was supposed to be, was shot in the thigh and mortally wounded. The story that came home, and that England chose to believe, was that as he lay dying of his wound he was offered water, and, seeing another wounded soldier eyeing the bottle, waved it away toward the other man with the words that his need was greater. Whether he said it or not, the whole country grieved for him as though it had lost a son. He was 31. Then Drake sailed into the harbour of Cadiz in 1587 and burned 30 Spanish ships at anchor, a raid he called singeing the King of Spain's beard. Each provocation was a calculated risk. Together, they made war inevitable. In the summer of 1588, the Armada set sail, 130 ships, carrying 30,000 men, with orders to sweep up the English Channel, link up with the Spanish army in the Netherlands, and invade England. The plan was to land near the Thames estuary and march on London. Philip believed that English Catholics would rise to join him. He believed God was on his side. He believed the sheer size of his fleet would terrify the English into surrender. Elizabeth believed none of it. She was 54 years old, her face lined under the white makeup, her body tired from decades of statecraft. But when the crisis came, she did not retreat. She went to Tilbury. Tilbury was an army camp on the north bank of the Thames, where Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, had assembled the main English land force. The soldiers were poorly equipped, hungry, and nervous. They knew the Spanish army was one of the most feared fighting forces in the world. They waited for the invasion with a kind of grim fatalism, and then, on August 9th, the Queen arrived. She rode through the camp on a white horse. She wore a silver breastplate over a white velvet gown. Her hair, still reddish gold, flowed loose down her back. She carried a truncheon in her hand like a general. The soldiers stared. They had heard the Queen was old. They had heard she was weak. The woman who rode among them was neither. She stopped in front of the assembled troops and spoke. The speech has been passed down in several versions, but the core of it is hers, unmistakably hers. "My loving people," she said, "I have been told to take heed how I commit myself to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I tell you, I would not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that, under God, I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects." She told them she had come not for recreation, not for spectacle, but to live or die among them. She told them she knew she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but she had the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too, and she promised, standing there in her white gown and silver breastplate, that she herself would take up arms and be their general, their judge, and the rewarder of their every virtue in the field. The soldiers cheered until they were hoarse. Some of them wept. The speech transformed the mood of the entire camp. The Queen, this aging woman who had been written off by every king in Europe, had done what no male monarch had done. She had stood before her army and made them believe. While she was speaking, the real battle was being fought at sea. The Armada had entered the channel in a crescent formation, 7 miles wide, a floating city of wood and canvas. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham and Sir Francis Drake, was smaller and faster. Their ships could turn more quickly. Their cannons could fire and reload faster. They harried the Spanish formation for days, darting into fire and pulling away before the Spanish could grapple and board. The Spanish guns were powerful but slow. The English guns were lighter but relentless. On the night of August 7th, the English sent 8 fireships drifting into the Spanish anchorage near Calais. The fireships were old vessels packed with pitch, gunpowder, and anything that would burn. When they went up, the Spanish panicked. They cut their anchor cables and scattered into the darkness. The next morning, the English fleet attacked the disorganized armada off the coast of Gravelines. The battle lasted 9 hours. Spanish ships were sunk, Spanish sailors drowned. The survivors, battered and low on supplies, fled north. Then the weather took over. A massive storm, what the English would call the Protestant wind, drove the Spanish fleet up around the coast of Scotland and Ireland. Ships were dashed against rocky cliffs. Men who made it to shore were killed by local inhabitants or died of exposure. Of the 130 ships that had set out, fewer than half made it back to Spain. Thousands of Spanish sailors never saw their homes again. Elizabeth processed the victory the way she processed everything, as a political performance. She ordered a national day of thanksgiving. She rode through London in a chariot, past cheering crowds, past banners that read Gloriana. She had a medal struck that showed the Spanish fleet being scattered by divine wind, with the inscription, "God blew and they were scattered." She commissioned the Armada portrait, in which she rests her hand on a globe, imperial and serene, while the defeated Spanish ships founder in the background. The myth of the Virgin Queen was now fused with the myth of the warrior queen. She was no longer just a woman who had refused to marry. She was the woman who had saved England. And then, in the middle of the triumph, the man she had loved for 30 years died. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, had been in poor health for months. The strain of commanding the army at Tilbury, the endless logistics, the sleepless nights had worn him down. In September of 1588, he set out to take the waters at Buxton, hoping the mineral springs would restore him. He got as far as Cornbury in Oxfordshire. There, on September 4th, he collapsed. He died alone in a rented room at the age of 56. The news reached Elizabeth at court. She did not speak for hours. She went to her private chambers and locked the door. Her ladies stood outside listening to her cry. She kept the last letter he had written her, a letter she had received just a few days before, sent from his sickbed. On the outside, in her own handwriting, she wrote, "His last letter." She kept it in a small chest by her bed for the rest of her life. Every so often her ladies would see her take it out and hold it, not reading it, just holding it. Robert Dudley was gone. Francis Walsingham, her spymaster, would die 2 years later. William Cecil, her constant advisor, would follow in 1598. The world Elizabeth had built, the inner circle that had propped her up for 3 decades, was crumbling away, and the years ahead would be harder than anything that had come before. The Armada victory had felt like the climax of a story, but it was not the end. Spain was still powerful. The war dragged on. Philip sent more armadas, smaller but still dangerous, in the years that followed. England responded with counter-expeditions, some successful, most costly failures. The worst of the failures came the very next year. Flushed with the victory of 1588, Elizabeth backed a great counterstroke against Spain. A fleet under Francis Drake and John Norris meant to finish off the surviving Spanish warships, seize the treasure fleet, and raise a rebellion in Portugal against Spanish rule. On paper, it was the mirror image of the Armada, England striking at Spain instead of the other way around. In practice, it was a disaster. Drake missed the crippled warships he had been sent to destroy. The Portuguese did not rise. Disease swept through the crowded English ships and killed men by the thousand. The fleet limped home, having achieved almost nothing, and something like half the men who sailed never came back. Drake, the hero of the Armada, the man Elizabeth had knighted on his own deck, fell out of favour for years. The lesson of the whole war, which Elizabeth understood better than any of her captains, was that it was one thing to defend your own coast with God and the weather on your side, and quite another to carry the fight to an empire that still dwarfed you. The treasury, which had been carefully rebuilt in the early years of the reign, was drained again. Taxes rose, harvests failed. The 1590s brought a series of cold, wet summers that ruined crops and left people hungry. The price of bread climbed beyond what the poor could afford. There were riots in the streets of London. Elizabeth, who had once been mobbed by adoring crowds, now rode through the city to silence and sullen stares. The glow of Gloriana was fading. Out of that misery came one of the most lasting things her reign ever produced, though it made no one cheer at the time. Faced with roads full of the starving and the homeless, her government passed a series of laws, gathered up at the very end of the reign into what became known as the Poor Law, that made each parish in England responsible for its own poor, funded by a tax on the people who could afford to pay. It was harsh in places, and it drew hard lines between those judged deserving of help and those judged idle. But it was also the first time a country had accepted, in law, that the state owed its poorest people something more than a whipping and a shrug. The system it set up would outlast Elizabeth by more than 200 years. She built no cathedrals and left no great monument of stone. This dry, unglamorous machinery for keeping the hungry alive was, in its way, one of the most enduring bricks she ever laid. She was growing old. Her teeth were blackened and falling out. Her hair was thin. The makeup she wore to preserve the illusion of ageless beauty was now a thick, chalky mask, white lead and vinegar that ate into her skin. She still dressed magnificently, in gowns encrusted with pearls and gold thread. But underneath the finery she was a woman in her 60s, tired to the bone, carrying a country on her back with fewer and fewer people to share the load. Her body was failing, but her mind never dulled. In 1593, at 59 years old, she sat down and translated The Consolation of Philosophy, the book Boethius had written in a Roman prison while awaiting his own execution, out of Latin and into English, in her own hand. Working fast and for no one's eyes but her own, it was a strange choice of comfort for an aging queen, a book about how to keep your soul intact while fortune turns against you, written by a condemned man. She seems to have found something in it she needed. The court changed around her. A new generation of ambitious young men circled the aging queen, not with love, but with calculation. They were looking past her, to the succession, to whoever would come next. Elizabeth knew it. She saw them whispering. She saw them making trips to Scotland to pay court to James. She was not ready to go, but she could feel the world pulling away from her. One of the brightest of that new generation had already risen and fallen before Essex came into his own, and his story showed exactly how the game was played at the end of Elizabeth's reign. Walter Raleigh was a tall, dark, sharp-tongued adventurer from the West Country, a soldier and a sailor and a poet who could talk his way into any room. He arrived at court in the early 1580s and rose with astonishing speed. The Queen liked his looks, liked his boldness, liked the way he flattered her without ever quite seeming to grovel. She gave him monopolies on wine and on the export of woolen cloth. She gave him great estates in Ireland. She knighted him and made him captain of the guard, the man responsible for her personal safety. When English ships planted a colony on the coast of the New World, Raleigh named the whole territory Virginia in honor of the Virgin Queen, and the name stuck to a piece of a continent. But Raleigh made the one mistake that could not be forgiven. In 1592, it came out that he had secretly married Bess Throckmorton, one of the Queen's own maids of honor, and that she was already carrying his child. He had done it behind Elizabeth's back, without permission, inside her own household, with a woman sworn to serve her. The reaction was exactly what it had been with Dudley and Lettice Knollys, only faster and colder. Elizabeth had both of them thrown into the Tower. Raleigh, the great favourite, the captain of the guard, sat in his cell writing frantic letters that compared the Queen to a goddess he had lost the sight of, hoping the old flattery would work one last time. It did not. He was let out after a few weeks, but he was finished as a favourite. He kept his head and his estates, but the golden years were over, and he knew it. The lesson, once again, was plain to everyone watching. There was room for exactly one woman at the centre of Elizabeth's court, and any man who forgot it paid for the lesson. Among the new men was Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He was the son of Lettice Knollys, the woman Elizabeth had once called a she-wolf. He had been a child when his mother was banished from court. Now he was tall, handsome, charming, and possessed of a reckless courage that reminded people of Robert Dudley in his youth. Elizabeth, despite herself, was drawn to him. He became her last favourite, the final object of her affection in a long life of carefully controlled desires. But Essex was not Dudley. He did not understand boundaries. He did not understand patience. He believed he could push the Queen, manipulate her, bend her to his will. And Elizabeth, who had bent to no man in 40 years, was not about to start now. The collision, when it came, would be catastrophic. Essex was a man who had been given everything and believed he deserved more. He had arrived at court in his early 20s, tall and athletic, with a dark beard and an easy laugh that made people forget he was the stepson of Robert Dudley and the son of the woman Elizabeth hated most. The Queen, now in her 60s, looked at him and saw something she had been missing for years. Not a lover, not a suitor, a son. Someone to fill the hole that her own childlessness had left. She indulged him in ways she had indulged no one since Dudley. She gave him military commands. She gave him a monopoly on sweet wines, a lucrative source of income that made him one of the wealthiest men in England. She forgave his outbursts, and there were many outbursts. The relationship was never stable. Essex was proud to the point of arrogance. He believed that his talent and his blood entitled him to power, and he resented the fact that Elizabeth kept him on a leash. They argued constantly. He would storm out of meetings. She would scream at him in front of the council. Then he would apologize, and she would forgive him, and the cycle would begin again. The court watched this drama with a mixture of fascination and dread. Essex was a man who did not know when to stop, and Elizabeth was a queen who had never been successfully defied. Some of the danger Essex conjured up himself. In 1594, he became convinced that the Queen's own physician, a Portuguese doctor named Rodrigo Lopez who had served her for years, was secretly plotting to poison her on behalf of Spain. The evidence was thin and largely dragged out under threat, and Elizabeth herself did not believe it. She called Essex a rash and temerarious youth to his face and refused to touch her doctor. But Essex had staked his reputation on the accusation, and he kept pushing until the machinery of the law took over. Lopez was tried, convicted, and dragged to the scaffold, where the crowd jeered as he swore that he loved the Queen as much as he loved Jesus Christ, a line that only made them laugh harder. Elizabeth had delayed signing the warrant for months, and she kept a ring Lopez had once given her for the rest of her life. It was Essex who had wanted the blood, and Essex who got it. The whole affair should have taught him something about the distance between the Queen's caution and his own hunger. It taught him nothing. His one real triumph came 2 years later. In 1596, Essex was given joint command of a great expedition against Spain, and this time he delivered. The English fleet fell on the port of Cadiz, stormed the harbour, burned the Spanish ships at anchor, and took the town itself. Essex was magnificent in the fighting, first over the walls, generous to the captured Spaniards, everything a hero of the age was supposed to be. He knighted so many of his own followers on the spot that people joked he had made more knights in a week than the Queen had made in years. He came home to bells and bonfires and crowds shouting his name in the street, and that was the problem. Elizabeth watched her favourite become the most popular man in England, cheered by the same crowds who barely troubled to look at their aging queen anymore, and something in her went cold. A favourite the people loved was one thing. A favourite the people loved more than they loved her. A young general with an army's loyalty and a gift for making himself the hero of every story was something closer to a rival. She began, quietly, to check him. She questioned his expenses. She denied him offices he expected, and Essex, who had never learned to read her the way Dudley had, took every check as an insult rather than a warning. In the middle of all this, in the late summer of 1598, she lost the man who had been the steady centre of her whole reign. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, had served her for 40 years, since that first morning when she made him promise to be honest and unbought. Now he was old and failing, and in his last illness the Queen came to sit with him herself. There is a story, and it has the ring of truth, that she fed him with her own hand, spooning broth into his mouth because his hands had grown too weak, and told him she did not wish to outlive him. He wrote to his son from his deathbed, praising the Queen who had just nursed him, and he died a few days later. Elizabeth wept openly. For weeks afterward, whenever Burghley's name was spoken in her presence, her eyes filled and she had to turn away. He had been her right hand for 4 decades, and now the hand was gone. The man circling to fill the gap in her government was Bapresi's clever, hunchbacked son, Robert Cecil, who loved her rather less and understood her rather better than his father ever had. The breaking point came in 1599. Ireland had been bleeding England for years. Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, had built a formidable rebel army, and the English garrisons were losing ground. Essex, desperate for glory and convinced he was the only man who could crush the rebellion, demanded to be sent to Ireland as Lord Lieutenant. Elizabeth was reluctant. She did not trust his judgment, and she did not want him out of her sight. But he wore her down. In March of 1599, he sailed for Dublin with the largest army England had ever sent to Ireland, 16,000 men, with orders to defeat Tyrone decisively and come home. He did not defeat Tyrone. He marched his army around the Irish countryside, skirmished inconclusively, and watched his forces melt away from disease and desertion. By the time he finally met Tyrone for a parley in September, his army was a shadow of what it had been. The two men spoke alone at a river crossing, and Essex agreed to a truce that was indistinguishable from surrender. Then, instead of staying in Ireland to salvage the situation, he abandoned his post. He rode for the coast, took a ship back to England, and galloped across the countryside to London. What happened next became one of the most notorious moments of the reign. Essex arrived at Nonsuch Palace on the morning of September 28th, filthy from the road, still in his mud-spattered riding clothes. He pushed past the guards, he strode through the chambers, he burst through the doors of the Queen's private apartments, and he found Elizabeth standing there, unclothed from the waist up, her grey hair down around her shoulders, her face bare of the white makeup she had worn in public for 40 years. She was an old woman, caught in her most private moment, and he had violated every boundary of decency and protocol. Elizabeth did not scream. She did not call for guards. She looked at him with a face that gave nothing away, and she told him to wait while she dressed. When she returned, fully clothed and painted, the mask back in place, she questioned him coldly. What was he doing here? Why had he left his army? Essex stammered out explanations. He was arrested that afternoon and placed under house arrest. The sweet wine monopoly was revoked. His enemies on the council, led by Robert Cecil, began to close in. Essex spent the next year in a kind of limbo, stripped of his offices, his income drying up, his influence evaporating. He grew desperate. He gathered around him a group of young, reckless men who told him what he wanted to hear, that the council was controlled by enemies who had poisoned the Queen against him, that he needed to act before it was too late, that London would rise for him if he showed himself. In February of 1601, he made his move. The plan was half-baked and doomed from the start. Essex and about 300 followers marched into the streets of London, shouting that the kingdom had been sold to Spain, that Cecil was a traitor, that the Queen needed to be rescued from her evil advisors. They expected the citizens of London to rise up. The citizens of London closed their doors and stayed inside. The rebellion collapsed within hours. Essex was captured, dragged back to the Tower, and put on trial for treason. The trial was a formality. He had taken up arms against the government. There was only one possible sentence, but Elizabeth hesitated. Essex was not just a traitor. He was the man she had loved as a son, the last of her favourites, the final flawed vessel of a lifetime of complicated affections. She signed the death warrant. She revoked it. She signed it again. The waiting must have been unbearable for Essex, who sat in his cell listening for footsteps, knowing that each hour of reprieve was a gift the Queen might take back. On February 25th, 1601, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, walked out onto a scaffold in the courtyard of the Tower of London. He was 34 years old. He knelt, prayed, and laid his head on the block. The executioner took 3 strokes to sever the neck. When the news was brought to Elizabeth, she was playing the virginals, a small keyboard instrument, in her privy chamber. She stopped, she put down her hands, and she sat in silence for a long time. The execution of Essex broke something in her. She had executed a cousin. She had executed a queen. Now she had executed the young man who had once made her laugh, who had once made her feel less alone. She had outlived almost everyone who had ever mattered to her. Dudley was dead. Walsingham was dead. Burghley was dead. Cat Ashley, the governess who had protected her since childhood, had died years earlier. The world she had known was gone, and she was still here, an aging woman on a throne that had cost her everything. There was one last time the country got to see the old Elizabeth, and it came, of all places, out of an argument about money. In the autumn of 1601, her final parliament met in a foul temper. For years the Crown had been granting monopolies to favoured courtiers, exclusive rights to sell or license everyday goods, salt and starch and vinegar and playing cards and 100 other things, and the men who held these patents had used them to drive prices up and pocket the difference. Ordinary people were paying more for the necessities of life so that a few insiders at court could grow rich, and Parliament had finally had enough. Members stood up in the Commons and read out the list of monopolies to shouts of anger. When one item was named, a voice called out from the benches, "Is not bread among them?" and the chamber went quiet at how close the thing had come to open revolt. A lesser ruler might have dug in. Elizabeth read the room the way she had been reading rooms since she was a frightened child at her father's court, and she gave way, gracefully, before she could be forced. She issued a proclamation cancelling the worst of the monopolies at once, and let it be known that the Queen herself had heard her people's complaint and answered it. Then she did something that turned a retreat into a triumph. She summoned about 140 members of the Commons to attend her at Whitehall, and she spoke to them. The speech that followed became known as the Golden Speech, and it was the last time she ever addressed her Parliament. She told them she had never set her heart on any worldly goods, only on the good of her people. She said that though God had raised her high, she counted the true glory of her crown to be that she had reigned with their love. She thanked them for catching the abuses before they had done more harm, and she took the blame gently onto herself for having trusted the men who committed them. There would be many mightier and wiser princes to sit in her chair, she told them, but never one who would love them more. The old men in the room, some of whom had served her for decades, wept while she spoke. She was 68 years old, worn thin, painted and bewigged and tired to the bone. And for one more afternoon she was Gloriana again, and the whole room felt it. Then she sent them home, and she never called a parliament together again. The last 2 years of her life were a slow, quiet decline. She moved the court to Richmond Palace, a beautiful red brick palace on the Thames, and she stayed there. She stopped going on progress. She stopped dancing. She spent long hours in her privy chamber, staring out the window at the river. Her ladies brought her meals, but she ate little. They tried to coax her into bed, but she refused. She would sit on cushions piled on the floor, her back against the wall, sometimes for hours, sometimes through the night. She told her doctors she was fine. She was not fine. The political business of the realm continued around her. Robert Cecil, the son of her old advisor, had taken over the management of the government. He was a small, hunchbacked man with a brilliant mind and a ruthless sense of self-preservation. He had been conducting secret correspondence with James VI of Scotland for months, preparing for the succession that everyone knew was coming. Elizabeth would not name an heir. She had spent her entire reign refusing to name an heir, because naming an heir meant naming a successor, and naming a successor meant admitting that she would someday die. But Cecil knew, everyone knew, James would be king. In the winter of 1602, Elizabeth's health collapsed. She had always been thin, but now she became skeletal. She developed a persistent cough. She had trouble swallowing. Her ladies dressed her in her elaborate gowns for state occasions, but the gowns hung loose on her frame, and her face under the white makeup was gaunt. She still held audiences. She still received foreign ambassadors. She still performed the role of Gloriana, but the performance was taking everything she had. By March of 1603, she could no longer pretend. She took to her chamber at Richmond and refused to leave. She would not let the doctors examine her. She would not take their medicines. She sat on her cushions, wrapped in a heavy cloak, and she stared into the fire. Her ladies begged her to go to bed. She refused. She said the bed would be her death. Perhaps she believed that if she never lay down, she would never die. On March 23rd, she lost the ability to speak. The ladies gathered around her, weeping. Robert Cecil came to her side. He knelt and asked her, gently, whether James of Scotland should succeed her. Elizabeth, too weak to speak, made a gesture with her hand. The witnesses described it differently. Some said she raised her hand to her head, as if placing a crown. Some said she simply nodded. The story may have been embellished later, to make the transition seem smoother than it was, but the outcome was not in doubt. James would be king. She lingered through the night. The candles burned low. The river outside the windows was black and silent. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the women who had served her, some of them for decades, all of them knowing they were watching the end of something they would never see again. At around 3 in the morning on March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor stopped breathing. She was 69 years old. She had reigned for 44 years, 4 months, and 7 days. Her death was kept secret for several hours. Robert Cecil needed time to send word to Edinburgh to make sure the transition was secure. The body lay in the bedchamber while messengers rode north through the cold March darkness. By noon, the proclamation was ready. James VI of Scotland was declared James I of England. The Tudor dynasty, which had begun with Henry VII at Bosworth Field 118 years earlier, was over. The funeral was held on April 28th. The coffin was draped in purple velvet and carried through the streets of London on a chariot drawn by 4 black horses. An effigy of the Queen, dressed in her parliamentary robes, lay on top of the coffin, holding a sceptre and a crown. The crowds lined the streets, and this time they were silent, not the cheering silence of expectation, but the heavy silence of grief. These were people who had known no other monarch. They had been born under Elizabeth. They had lived their entire lives under Elizabeth, and now she was gone. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the north aisle of the Henry VII Chapel, the same chapel where her grandfather lay. She was placed in a vault that already held the body of her sister, Mary Tudor. The tomb was a strange and poignant piece of architecture. Above the vault, the effigy shows only Elizabeth, lying in state, crowned and serene. But underneath, in the darkness, the 2 sisters rest together. The inscription on the tomb, dictated by James, reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep. Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in hope of the resurrection." She left behind a country that was unrecognizable from the one she had inherited. When she took the throne in 1558, England was a bankrupt, divided island on the edge of Europe, torn apart by religious strife and threatened by every major power. When she died, England was a Protestant nation with a stable church, a growing navy, the beginnings of a global trading empire, and a cultural confidence that would define it for centuries. The East India Company, founded in the final year of her reign, would grow into the engine of British imperialism. The plays of Shakespeare, written for the Globe Theatre during her reign, would become the foundation of English literature. The language she spoke, the religious settlement she crafted, the image of a strong woman ruling alone in a world of men, all of it endured. But she also left behind questions that have never been fully answered. Was the Virgin Queen truly a virgin, or was the image a political fabrication built to hold a throne? Historians still argue over whether she signed Mary Stuart's death warrant in genuine anguish, or as the last calculated move in a patient 20-year strategy to remove a rival. They argue over whether she was a great queen or simply a survivor who got lucky, propped up by brilliant advisors and favourable winds. The debates go on, and they will probably never be settled. What is certain is that she was, in the deepest sense, alone. She had chosen that aloneness. She had cultivated it. She had made it the source of her power and the condition of her survival. And in the end, when the fire burned low and the river ran dark outside the windows at Richmond, she was as alone as any monarch has ever been. No husband to hold her hand, no child to weep at her bedside, just the women who had dressed her and undressed her and watched her age, decade by decade, from a fiery young queen into a silent old woman sitting on a cushion because she refused to lie down and die. She had given her life to the throne, and the throne had taken everything. That was the bargain. She understood it better than anyone. And so, in the quiet of this night, we leave her there. At Richmond, the candles burning low, the river moving slowly past the windows. The woman who was born a bastard, who was thrown into the Tower by her own sister, who defied every king in Europe, who loved a man she could never marry, who stood in silver armour before her army and made them believe. Elizabeth Tudor, the last of the Tudors, the queen who became England. Sleep well. Good night.